He was a farmer's son from a Quaker family in rural Somerset, England, with no formal training in shoemaking, no factory, and no capital to speak of. Just a tannery workshop stacked with sheep hides and the smell of tallow in the air. He wasn't even trying to build a shoe company. He was trying to keep his floor clean. You would think a man working with sheepskin rug scraps swept off a workshop floor could never build one of the most recognized footwear brands on earth, right? Well, Cyrus Clark and his younger brother James turned those scraps into a slipper. That slipper became a company. And 200 years later, that company, Clark's, has sold shoes to hundreds of millions of people in more than 20 countries, dressed the feet of dock workers and duchesses, reggae legends and Wu-Tang Clan rappers, all starting from a pile of leftover sheepskin nobody else wanted. So how did a poor English boy from a Quaker farm turn workshop floor sweepings into a global shoe empire? To find out, we have to go back to Street Somerset in the early 1800s. Street was not much of a place in 1801, the year Cyrus Clark was born. It was a small village in the west of England, the kind of place with more sheep than people, threaded together by a handful of lanes, a parish church, and not a whole lot else. The Clark family had lived in and around Street for generations, and they were Quakers, members of the Religious Society of Friends, a faith that had cost earlier generations of Clarks their freedom. Back in 1662, a family ancestor named John Clark had been thrown into Ilchester jail simply for practicing his beliefs. That kind of history does something to a family. It teaches you that the world does not owe you anything, and that whatever you build with your own two hands. Cyrus's parents, Joseph Clark and Frances Sturge, raised their sons on hard work and plain living, the two virtues that formed the backbone of Quaker life. There were 3 boys. Joseph the younger would stay home and inherit the family farm, a property called Hindhays, and spend his life working the Somerset soil the way his father had before him. Cyrus, born in 1801, had other ideas, and 10 years later, in 1811, a 3rd son was born, James, the baby of the family, the one who would eventually finish what his older brother started. And the 2 brothers could not have been more different, which turned out to be exactly what the business needed. Cyrus was the elder, the steady one, the planner, a man who thought in terms of premises, partnerships, and ledgers. James, 10 years younger, was the tinkerer, the one who noticed things other people walked past 100 times without seeing. Cyrus built the platform. James would eventually stand on it and spot the opportunity that changed everything. Neither brother could have built Clark's alone. Together, without ever quite planning it that way, they built something neither of them could have imagined as boys on a Somerset farm. Cyrus wasn't destined for the farm, and he wasn't destined for wealth either. Somerset in the early 1800s ran on wool and leather, and by his early 20s, Cyrus had gone into the trade that half the young men in the county went into, felmongering. That's the unglamorous business of buying raw sheepskins, stripping the wool from the hide, and selling both separately, the wool to spinners, the hide to tanners. It was dirty, physical, thankless work. In 1821, Cyrus entered a partnership with a Quaker cousin to do exactly that in Street. It didn't last. By 1825, the partnership had dissolved, and 24-year-old Cyrus was on his own. No business partner, limited savings, and a father-in-law generous enough to let him use a plot of land on the high street to try something new. And here's where the flaw, or maybe you'd call it the constraint, comes in. Cyrus had no formal training as a manufacturer. He wasn't an inventor. He didn't have a patent or a breakthrough idea sitting in a drawer somewhere. What he had was a habit that would define the next 200 years of his family's business. Instead of throwing away a byproduct, He looked for a way to use it. Rather than simply stripping the wool off sheepskins and discarding the hide, the way every other felmonger in Somerset did, Cyrus had a different idea. What if you kept the wool attached to the skin and sold the whole thing as a rug? It sounds small. It wasn't. It was the first sign that this family had a gift for turning what everyone else considered waste into something valuable. By 1828, the rug business had grown enough that Cyrus needed help, and he brought on his 17-year-old brother James as an apprentice. James was not the university type. None of the Clark brothers were, really, but he had a sharp, practical eye, and he spent his days at the tannery surrounded by the raw material of the family trade: hide, wool, and endless offcuts of sheepskin that piled up on the workshop floor with nowhere to go. Nobody in Street thought much of James Clark. In 1828, he was just the younger brother, sweeping floors and learning the family trade. But he was about to notice something everyone else in that workshop had been stepping over for years. Somewhere around 1825, in the middle of all those offcuts, James looked down at a heap of sheepskin scraps that were too small and too irregular to be sold as rugs. Most people would have seen garbage. James saw a shape. If you cut the scrap the right way and stitched a sole onto it, you had something that would slide right onto a tired foot at the end of a long day, a slipper. It was not a eureka moment that changed everything overnight. Actually, we do not know if James shouted anything at all that day in the workshop. The record does not tell us. But we do know the idea stuck with him, and over the next few years, he and Cyrus refined it, cutting patterns from the sheepskin, testing stitching, working out how to turn a rug maker's garbage into a wearable, sellable product. By 1830, the brothers had something ready for the market: a soft, warm, fleece-lined slipper made from the very scraps that used to be swept into a corner and forgotten. They called it the Brown Petersburg, a name almost nobody used for long, because customers quickly shortened it to something easier to say: the Brown Peter. I want you to sit with that for a second. The very first Clark shoe in history was not the product of some grand design process. It was quite literally trash. Sheepskin rug scraps that would have otherwise been thrown out, turned into a slipper by two Quaker brothers with no design training and no fashion background whatsoever. And yet the Brown Peter would go on to become one of the best-selling slippers in England. Because here is the thing about a genuinely good, honestly made product: word travels. The Brown Peter was warm, it was comfortable, it was well made by people who took their trade seriously, and it was priced for ordinary working households, not the wealthy few. Sales started slow, as they always do. But by 1842, 12 years after that first batch went out the door, the Clark brothers were selling somewhere around 1,000 pairs of Brown Peter slippers every single month, out of a small Somerset village, out of scrap material. That is the kind of number that would have seemed impossible to Cyrus and James back when they were sweeping that workshop floor in 1825. But you cannot make 1,000 pairs of slippers a month with just two brothers and a workbench. That kind of demand creates a problem almost as big as the opportunity itself. How do you scale a handmade product without a factory, without machines, and without the capital to build either? The Clarks' answer would become one of the defining features of early industry in Street. Instead of building one giant workshop and hiring workers to sit inside it, which they couldn't afford to do anyway, they took the sheepskin scraps and sent them out into the surrounding villages. Local families, mostly women working from their own kitchens and front rooms, would collect bundles of scrap leather from the Clark tannery, cut and stitch the slippers at home, and bring the finished pairs back in exchange for a wage. It was a distributed workforce before anyone had a word for that. An entire cottage industry grew up around street, built on Clark family sheepskin scraps and stitched together, quite literally, by hand in homes up and down the county. This mattered for two reasons. First, it let two brothers with no factory compete with far larger operations, because their production capacity wasn't limited by the size of one building. It was limited only by how many households they could supply with scrap leather. Second, and just as important for a Quaker family that took its faith seriously, it put money directly into the hands of local working families during a period when rural England badly needed it. The Clarks weren't just building a business. Whether they fully realized it yet or not, they were building a community around that business, one that would outlast both founding brothers by more than a century and a half. There is a piece of this story that's easy to miss if you don't know much about Quaker history in England, and it's worth pausing on, because it explains a lot about how two brothers from a village nobody had heard of built connections across an entire empire. Quakers in the 1800s were barred from most of the traditional professions open to English gentlemen. They couldn't attend Oxford or Cambridge, couldn't sit in Parliament until well into the century, and were shut out of most of the established institutions that ran the country. So generation after generation, Quaker families did what excluded people so often do. They built their own network, and they built it on trust. Because Quakers refused to swear oaths, haggle dishonestly, or go recklessly into debt, at least in principle, a Quaker's word became, in the world of English trade, close to a guarantee. Other Quaker merchants, bankers, and manufacturers would extend credit to a fellow friend that they'd never extend to a stranger. It's the same network that helped families like the Cadburys and the Rowntrees build chocolate empires, and the same network behind banks like Barclays and Lloyds. And it's the same network that gave two unknown brothers from a Somerset sheep town access to capital, contacts, and customers all the way across the British Empire, long before the name C&J Clark meant anything to anyone outside street. This mattered enormously for Cyrus and James, because it meant their little slipper business didn't have to stay little. Orders came in from Quaker-connected merchants in London, in Bristol, eventually as far as the colonies. The company grew steadily through the 1830s and the 1840s on the back of a product that people genuinely liked and a network that trusted the people selling it. By the early 1850s, C&J Clark wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. It was becoming a name. By the middle of the 19th century, C&J Clark, as the brothers now formally called their partnership, was no longer just a village operation. But if you told a shoemaker in London or Northampton, the traditional centers of English footwear manufacturing, that a couple of Quaker farm boys from a Somerset village were about to be recognized on a national stage, they probably would have laughed. Street wasn't a shoemaking town. It wasn't even really an industrial town. It was sheep country. Then came 1851, and the Great Exhibition, Prince Albert's spectacular showcase of British industry and innovation, staged inside the Crystal Palace in London, the kind of event that drew royalty, industrialists, and roughly 6 million visitors over its run. This was the world stage, and Cyrus and James Clark, sons of a Somerset farming family, entered their work, including a rubberized gutta-percha galosh they'd developed, right alongside the biggest manufacturers in the British Empire. They won, not one award, but two, including a gold medal for that galosh design. For a small provincial firm built on the leftovers of a wool business, a gold medal at the Great Exhibition wasn't just a nice trophy, it was proof, delivered on the largest possible stage, that what the Clark brothers were building in street was not a fluke. It was legitimate, it was serious, and it was only getting started. But, and there's always a but in a story like this one, Success has a way of hiding problems until they can no longer be ignored. And the very product that had built the company's fortune, the humble brown Peter slipper, was about to become the company's biggest liability. Fashions change. That's a lesson every consumer business eventually learns the hard way, and the Clark brothers were no exception. Through the 1850s and into the 1860s, demand for the brown Peter slipper, the product that had built this entire company, began to slip. Tastes moved on, competitors emerged, and running alongside the sales slump was something just as dangerous, a run of bad business decisions. You see, Cyrus and James had never really been trained in finance any more than they'd been trained as cobblers. They'd built the business on instinct, hard work, and a genuinely good product. And for 35 years, that had been enough. But by the early 1860s, a combination of volatile market conditions, insufficient financial discipline, and, frankly, some poor planning had left the company dangerously overextended. The very qualities that had made the Clark brothers such effective founders, their willingness to take a chance, their comfort doing things their own way, were now working against them. By 1863, the company that had started with sheepskin scraps and grown into a nationally recognized shoemaker was staring down bankruptcy, total collapse. Everything Cyrus and James had built over nearly 4 decades was about to disappear, not because of some external disaster, but because of debts of their own making. 1863. Picture it. Cyrus Clark, now 62 years old, and James, 52, staring at ledgers that told them their family's entire life's work was about to collapse. 38 years since Cyrus had first set up shop with borrowed premises and a good idea about sheepskin rugs. 33 years since the brown Peter slipper had first gone on sale. All of it now hanging by a thread over debts the company could not pay. The stakes were about as high as they could get. If C&J Clark went under in 1863, it wouldn't just be a business failure. It would mean the end of income for the hundreds of outworkers across Somerset who depended on Clark sheepskin scraps for their wages. It would mean the Clark name, a name that had won a gold medal on the world stage just 12 years earlier, would become a cautionary tale instead of a success story. And for 2 aging Quaker brothers who had built this business on trust and reputation within their own faith community, financial collapse carried a weight that went beyond money. It would have felt like a betrayal of everything they stood for. So they did the only thing left to do. They turned to their community. The Clarks reached out to their contacts within the Society of Friends, the same Quaker network of bankers, merchants, and manufacturers that had helped their business grow for decades, and asked for a loan to keep the company alive. The Quaker community said yes, but the deal came with a condition that must have been painful for 2 proud founders to accept. Cyrus and James would step back from day-to-day control of the business they had built from nothing. In their place would come James's son, a young man in his mid-20s named William Stevens Clark, who would be trusted to save what his father and uncle had spent nearly 4 decades building. Think about what that must have felt like. You spend your entire adult life building something out of literal garbage, sheepskin scraps nobody else wanted, turning it into a company that wins gold medals in front of royalty. And then, because of debts and decisions you can't undo, you have to hand the keys to your own son and step aside, unsure whether he can save what you couldn't. William Stevens Clark was young and untested, and he'd inherited a company teetering on the edge, saddled with debt and a shaken reputation. Nobody, least of all the Quaker lenders who had just bailed the family out, knew for certain that a 20-something with no track record could turn around a business his own father and uncle, men decades his senior, with far more experience, had nearly run into the ground. Would he actually be able to save it? Or would C&J Clark simply become one more Somerset business that flared bright and burned out? William didn't waste time proving himself. He put together an aggressive repayment plan, one that prioritized paying down the company's debt above almost everything else, even at the cost of slower growth in the short term. It was disciplined, it was unglamorous, and crucially, it worked. Year after year through the late 1860s and early 1870s, the debt shrank. By 1873, a full decade after the crisis had nearly ended the company, William had not only stabilized C&J Clark, he had earned enough trust and results to become a full partner in the business alongside his father James. The loan was repaid in full. The Clark name was safe. With the company's finances finally stable and William Stevens Clark firmly at the helm, C&J Clark entered a new era, and it would prove far bigger than anything Cyrus or James could have imagined back when they were cutting slippers out of scrap leather in the 1820s. William modernized everything. He brought in the factory system, moving production out of scattered cottages and into a proper, organized workshop. He invested in Singer sewing machines, a genuinely revolutionary piece of technology in the shoemaking trade at the time, allowing the company to produce shoes faster and more precisely than the old hand-stitching methods ever could. And in 1883, 20 years after the company had nearly gone bankrupt, Clark's launched something that would define its reputation for the next century and beyond: the hygienic range. Here's why that mattered. Up until that point, most shoes in England and most of the world were made as straights, meaning the left shoe and the right shoe were identical, cut from the same last, with no distinction for the actual shape of a human foot. The hygienic range changed that. It was designed to fit the real, actual contours of the human foot, with a genuine left and a genuine right. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but it was a foundational shift in how footwear was made, and it planted the seed of an identity that Clark's has carried ever since. Not the flashiest shoe, not the trendiest shoe, but the one that actually fits. And this is remarkable when you consider where this company started. Two Quaker farm boys from a village with more sheep than people, working with material that used to be swept into a corner and thrown away, built a company that, within 60 years, was pioneering the science of how shoes should actually fit the human body. The very same instinct that made Cyrus look at a sheepskin offcut and see a slipper was the instinct that made his family's company, 2 generations later, look at a standard, straight shoe and ask, why does it have to be this way? 6th-generation Clark family shoemaker Lancelot Clark would later put the family's guiding philosophy into a single sentence that could apply to nearly every decision this company made across 2 centuries. If you teach your workers well, it is good for business. That wasn't corporate messaging dreamed up by a marketing department. It was a genuine reflection of the Quaker values that Cyrus and James had carried with them since childhood on that Somerset farm. The belief that a business is only as strong as the people and the community holding it up. By the turn of the 20th century, the company Cyrus Clark had started in 1825 with borrowed premises and a pile of sheepskin scraps had become one of the most respected footwear manufacturers in England, employing thousands of people across street and the surrounding villages, building homes for its workers, funding schools, and shipping shoes across the British Empire. The poor Quaker farm boys' improvised slipper business had become an institution. The decades that followed only deepened that reputation. Through the final years of the 19th century and into the 20th, C&J Clark kept growing steadily, the same way it always had. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the company's factories turned a portion of their output towards supplying boots for British soldiers, just as they would again during the Second World War, a generation later. Meanwhile, back home in Street, William Stevens Clark and the generations of Clarks who followed him kept pouring the company's profits back into the town itself. Libraries, a school, playing fields, even a swimming pool, all funded by a shoe company that had started with two brothers and a pile of scraps. By the middle of the 20th century, it was hard to find a building in Street that didn't carry the Clark family's fingerprints somewhere on it. This wasn't charity handed down from on high. It was the same Quaker instinct that had built the outworker network 100 years earlier. The belief that a company's success and its community's welfare were never really two separate things. That institution didn't stop evolving. In 1949, more than a century after Cyrus first set up shop, a Clark family descendant named Nathan Clark was serving in Burma during the Second World War when he noticed something interesting. Off-duty officers wearing simple suede boots with thick crepe soles, boots they had picked up in the markets of Cairo, built to handle brutal desert heat. Nathan brought the idea home to Street, and in 1949, Clark's launched the original desert boot. It debuted at the Chicago Shoe Fair that same year and was soon featured in American fashion press. Within a few decades, that boot had traveled from British Army officers in North Africa to the streets of Kingston, Jamaica, where it became a genuine cultural icon in reggae and dancehall music. A Somerset farm family's sheepskin business, indirectly responsible for one of the most recognizable boots in global youth culture. Then, in 1967, came the Wallaby, a soft, moccasin-style shoe with that same crepe sole, which would go on to become an emblem of hip-hop style, worn decades later by artists like Ghostface Killah and Raekwon of the Wu-Tang Clan. From a Somerset sheep pasture to Wu-Tang Clan lyrics, you would be hard-pressed to find a stranger, more unlikely journey in the history of English manufacturing. But Clark's story, like most real stories, wasn't a straight line up. In 1993, more than a century after William Stevens Clark saved the company from its first brush with bankruptcy, the Clark family faced another reckoning. A takeover offer worth roughly £184 million from an investment group called Beresford landed on the table, and the company's own board recommended accepting it. The family split bitterly over the decision. In a tense shareholder meeting on May 7, 1993, the family voted the sale down, choosing, once again, to keep control of what their ancestors had built rather than cash out. It was a costly choice in some ways. It forced the company to bring in outside professional management for the first time in its history to modernize operations. But it kept the name and the values behind it in Clark hands for another generation. That new professional leadership did modernize the company, and for a while it worked. But the deeper tension the 1993 vote had exposed, family stewardship versus outside ownership, never fully went away. When the pandemic gutted footwear retail worldwide in 2020, Clark's came closer to the edge than it had in nearly 30 years. And in 2021, the Clark family sold a majority stake to a private equity firm, ending an unbroken run of family ownership that had lasted almost 200 years. Within months, some Clark's workers publicly accused the new owners of threatening pay cuts and walking away from the very worker welfare principles Cyrus and James had built into the company from its first days in that street tannery. It was a jarring headline for a brand whose entire identity had been built on treating its people well. The road since hasn't always been smooth. Global competition eventually forced Clark's to move its manufacturing out of Britain entirely by the mid-2000s, ending nearly 2 centuries of shoes actually being made in Somerset. The COVID-19 pandemic hit the company hard enough that in 2021, the family sold a majority stake to outside investors for the first time since 1825. And as recently as 2024, Clark's was still posting tens of millions of pounds in losses. Yet in 2025, exactly 200 years after Cyrus Clark first swept sheepskin scraps into a pile on a street workshop floor, the company returned to profitability, posting a £31 million after-tax profit and celebrating its 200th anniversary with new stores and renewed global growth, especially across Asia. 2 centuries, multiple near collapses, and still, somehow, still standing, still recognized in more than 20 countries around the world, all traced back to a poor Quaker farm boy who looked at a pile of garbage and saw a shoe. That's the part of this story I think about the most. Not the gold medal, not the desert boot, not even the 200th birthday. It's the image of 2 brothers with no money and no plan, standing in a workshop full of what everyone else considered rubbish, deciding to make something useful out of it anyway. Every single crisis this company survived afterward, the 1863 near collapse, the 1993 family standoff, the pandemic, the losses of the early 2020s, came down to some version of that same choice. Rebuild with what you have, lean on the people around you, and refuse to let the story end on a bad chapter. Cyrus Clark never set out to build a global brand. He set out to make an honest living from his father-in-law's borrowed plot of land, using whatever material he had on hand and refusing to waste any of it. That instinct, take what you have, waste nothing, treat people fairly, and let the work speak for itself, carried a Somerset sheepskin business through 200 years, 3 centuries, and more reinventions than anyone in 1825 could have possibly imagined. And it's proof that the biggest companies in the world don't always start with brilliant plans or deep pockets. Sometimes they start with scraps on a workshop floor and someone willing enough to notice.